Good evening, everybody. It's Stephen. Good to be with you. And we are going to be looking at something that is probably more on our minds now than it ever has been in previous times. First of all, think about a month or greater ago when we would talk to someone and maybe try and make plans, and we would ask them, do you have something this day or that day or the other? And or have you had a chance to get to this, that, or the other? And more often than not, what a lot of people would say is, well, I'm sorry, I haven't been able to get to it. I won't be able to attend this or make this appointment because I am busy at that point in time. One of the things that most of us are not these days is busy. And I happened to come across a pretty popular acronym for busy. So you take the letters B-U-S-Y, busy, being under Satan's yoke. Now, that isn't always true. Busyness isn't always a bad thing, but it can become a bad thing if it teaches us or permits us to veer our focus from the things that truly matter. And I would hope that in life, no matter what the circumstances may be, that we can all agree that God is the most important, or at least should be the most important person in our lives. And because of that, that should drive our focus. Max Weber, who was a German sociologist, wrote this. He said, "In no other religion was the pride of the predestined aristocracy of salvation so closely associated with the man of a vocation and with the idea that success is rationalized activity demonstrates God's blessing as in Puritanism. And hence, in no other religion was the influence of ascetic motivation upon the attitude toward economic activity so strong. The contribution which this doctrine of grace made to the rationalized capitalistic temperament, the idea of the methodical demonstration of vocation in one's economic behavior." Now, if you've ever read Max Weber's Sociology of Religion, he has a lot of interesting insights. But that quote that I just read essentially points to the belief that industriousness, all the way back in American history, was a part and parcel of Orthodox Calvinism that was taught. Because the way that it went, first of all, Calvin's doctrine of predestination left people wondering, well, who's truly saved? And so to answer that question was whoever is a hard worker, an industrious person. And so people began to work hard to justify that they were saved according to the Calvinistic doctrine of predestination and the interpretation of grace. And that ultimately led all of American society to be a very hardworking, constantly going, industrious people, which isn't a bad thing. It's much better than the person who is able to work but is lazy and just refuses to work. But one of the things that we have lost in our society that perhaps now because of COVID-19 we have regained is a sense of rest, or as the Jews would have said, Sabbath. The term Sabbath itself literally means cease, stop. That's what it means. We think of the Sabbath, we think of Saturday for most of us. But the principle of the Sabbath is precisely what I wanted to look at today. And so I want to read one more quotation from a book that I read several years ago. The author is Joseph Pieper. His book, Leisure. He says, "The value we set on work and on leisure is very far different from being the same as that of the Greek and the Roman world, or of the Middle Ages for that matter. So very different that the men of the past would have been incapable of understanding the modern conception of work, just as we are unable to understand their notion of leisure simply and directly without an effort of thought." So today, whereas our society prides constant industriousness, older societies, even the first and second centuries of Christianity in ancient Rome and Greece, up to the Middle Ages, they valued leisure. And so what's interesting about this, at least, is the fact that they worked for what they needed rather than the accumulation of wealth or of things. And so I think if we go back to the Bible, one of the things that we can certainly see is that a rule of Sabbath is good, and many of us have had a Sabbath forced upon us because of the things that are happening around the world, specifically with relation to COVID-19. Now, why do I bring all this up? Well, I think it's possible for our labors to become idolatrous. I think it's possible for us to become so wrapped up in production that we, if you will, that we almost see that as the virtue. And one of the things we seldom, if ever, do is actually stop and give the necessary time to focus on God that we should. Some of you remember and are old enough to remember that on Sundays, various businesses and industries were closed. I remember watching an episode of the Andy Griffith Show, and on one particular Sunday, there was a gentleman who was coming through Mayberry, and he had car trouble. And so he kind of broke down right in front of Andy's house, and Andy had told him where he could go. He said, but he's not open today. And so this guy, who was from a big city, was accustomed to things being instant. But Andy was telling this guy who was passing through, Mayberry all but shuts down on Sunday. And why was that? Well, in those days, society was a lot more religious than it tends to be today. Today, it's a lot more secular. And even we Christians have bowed to the secularism of society. How many of us frequent businesses on Sundays? That may be our only day. But the reality is, one thing that we could all do well from is to learn to Sabbath. Not observe the Sabbath, but to cease itself. And there are 3 lessons from Israel having rested that we can learn from. But first we turn, if you will, to Exodus 20, verses 9 through 11. This is when the Sabbath was instituted. God says, 6 days you shall labor and do all your work, but the 7th day is the Sabbath of the Lord your God. In it you shall do no work, you nor your son, nor your daughter, nor your male servant, nor your female servant, nor your cattle, nor your stranger who is within your gates. For in 6 days the Lord made the heavens and the earth, the sea and all that is in them, and rested the 7th day. Therefore the Lord blessed the Sabbath day and hallowed it, or made it holy. So the 7th day in our calendar is Saturday. And at least for Israel and the ancient Jews, every Saturday, beginning at sundown on Friday to sundown on Saturday, that was the Sabbath. Shabbat is how you'd say that in Hebrew. But when you and I look to Israel's example, again, this is not a teaching so much in the New Testament as it is the wisdom of God shown forth in the Bible as a whole. First of all, when Israel forewent work on the Sabbath, they proclaimed their faith in God's ability to provide for the nation. And so one of the things that you and I have to remember at all times is what Paul said in Philippians 4:19. My God will supply every need of yours according to his riches in glory in Christ Jesus. I know that there are times that are crunch times when we're required to work very hard because of deadlines. Normally, this time of the year would be very hectic for accountants due to the April 15th deadline to have one's taxes filed. Obviously, that has been amended somewhat, but I know this is a very busy time for that profession. But if our entire occupation is composed of deadlines and rushing, it may be possible that we're hurting ourselves and only working to store up treasures on earth. And when we forego rest, or when we forego work to rest, we do our bodies a lot of good. And we also trust in God that he will aid us in our workload. One of the things that I've always encouraged college students to do, specifically the freshmen when they are in their freshman year of college, is, don't be afraid to just take some time and to not focus on schoolwork. Now, that doesn't mean be irresponsible, but there's one story when we were working with a congregation in Bowling Green, Kentucky. There was a freshman, in college my wife and I came to know, and she was really struggling with her studies. And because of that, she was devoting a lot of her time to those studies, which we would expect any good student to do. But what she did was think she had to go all in, so much so that she didn't attend the services or the assembly of the church there in Bowling Green, and she allowed her Christianity to become somewhat lax. Now, I know everyone will probably have a different opinion on this, but I'll tell you what I told her. I said, I think if anything, you need to make God a priority. Be sure that you assemble with the saints on the Lord's day. And I think by then having that faith that I don't have to put God on hold, but that I can make God a focus and a priority, He will fill in the gaps. I remember when I was working on my dissertation for my doctorate degree, that sometimes I would stare at the material so much that I would just have to take time away. I would take a day or two off, and usually when I went back, I was able to see it afresh and to make better progress as a result. And I think the same can be said for most of us. It's possible to go so long and so hard that you hit a wall, and if we don't rest, if we don't cease, then we become unproductive. I remember when I was in high school and we used to lift weights all the time, it seemed like every so often one of us would get to a plateau to where we couldn't bench press any more than what we had been for a while, or squat or something else. And so our coach would make us take a week off of lifting altogether. He'd say, just have fun, enjoy yourself, get plenty of sleep, let your body rest. And it often happened that after that week of rest, you'd come back, you had a renewed vigor, and you were ready to go, and you could actually increase the amount that you would lift. So sometimes by taking the break, by just backing away, turning your brain off, and focusing on something else or someone else, it really works to our benefit. But when we do this, we are demonstrating our faith in God and proclaiming that faith in His ability to provide no matter what. I know there have been farmers who have assembled with the saints when there were crops and livestock that needed tending, but God was a priority. And I know that there have been others who have assembled with the saints because to them God was a priority. And they did so realizing that He could and He would provide. And Israel did the same. By resting, by ceasing, they proclaimed their faith in God's ability to provide for the nation. Secondly, by resting or by observing the Sabbath, they recognized God's sovereignty and God's ability to make life possible. The psalmist said in Psalm 46, verse 10, "Be still and know that I am God." If you and I are constantly busy, one of the things that we are not doing is making time to focus on God. And so by ceasing, by actually stopping to focus on God, we are recognizing the sovereignty that He has over everything we stress about, over every deadline we may be facing for the coming week. But also, we're reminded that our life ultimately comes from Him. As He said to Adam, "For you are dust, and to dust you shall return." When Israel rested by using God's rest as their basis, they recognized His sovereignty and His ability to make life possible. So we got to take time to reflect and to focus on God. But when we work so much and so hard and we don't take that time, we cannot reflect on the fact that God made life and that He is sovereign over it. Even our present circumstances, God is sovereign over, and He will take care of us and supply every need that we have through whatever we face. Finally, in the second giving of the law called Deuteronomy, God reminded the second generation of Israelites to keep the Sabbath, and he said it was to be a reminder of his redemptive power. In Deuteronomy 5:15, he said, "Remember that you were a slave in the land of Egypt, and the Lord your God brought you out from there by a mighty hand and by an outstretched arm. Therefore, the Lord your God commanded you to keep the Sabbath day." One of the things that God was able to do in reminding them of where he had brought them was to remind them to cease. When you and I think about ourselves, we realize that God has redeemed us. And so we don't have to always be occupied with temporal matters, but we can, and as a matter of fact, should take time for the heavenly matters or the celestial matters. Now, even though Jesus said in Mark 2:27 that the Sabbath was made for man and not man for the Sabbath, we have to realize that that very statement, Jesus was saying God gave this principle of ceasing, of resting, so that by keeping and observing a rule of Sabbath, we could rest because God made us so that we would require rest. And though work is a good thing and it bears fruit, it's only temporary until we enter the eternal Sabbath rest that God has prepared for his saints. Hebrews 4:9 and 10 says, "So then there remains a Sabbath rest for the people of God, for whoever has entered God's rest has also rested from his works as God did from his." The entrance into eternity is the ultimate Sabbath, cessation. That's when our labors will have been done. And so we should take time to accustom ourselves to it here on earth so that we can better enjoy it. Sadly, however, what we're facing now isn't a Sabbath of our own choosing, but for many of us, it is a Sabbath thrust upon us. And so hopefully during this time, we can recall God's redemptive power. We can recognize and acknowledge his sovereignty and the fact that he makes life possible, and we can have faith in his ability to provide for us all that we need. May God bless you. We love you, and we're praying for you.